Today I'm going to expose the Bugatti part scammer who conned me out of thousands of pounds. Yep, embarrassingly, I have been scammed.
The story begins with a powerful mix of ambition, pressure, and trust, centered around three key figures: Mark McCann, Matt Armstrong, and a skilled behind-the-scenes mechanic known as Bob. From the very start, it is clear that this is not just about fixing a car, but about solving a problem that even experts struggle with. Mark McCann is dealing with a damaged Bugatti Veyron, a car that represents not only luxury, but also extreme engineering complexity. At the same time, Matt Armstrong, who has built a reputation for rebuilding some of the most difficult cars on YouTube, is also facing a similar gearbox issue with his own Veyron project. This creates a unique situation where both creators are connected by the same challenge, and their journeys begin to overlap. Bob, who is known for his technical skills and deep understanding of complex mechanical systems, plays a quiet but important role in the background. He represents the kind of expertise needed to even attempt such a repair, especially when dealing with rare parts that are no longer easily available. Together, these three figures highlight different sides of the same problem. Mark brings the emotional pressure and financial risk, Matt brings experience and confidence from past rebuilds, and Bob brings the technical knowledge required to make things actually work. The situation quickly becomes more intense when they realize that getting a replacement gearbox for the Veyron is not simple at all. The manufacturer does not make it easy to buy such parts, and even when they are available, the prices are extremely high. This forces them to look outside official channels, where the risks are much greater. What starts as a logical search for a solution slowly turns into a dangerous situation, where trust becomes the most important factor. As Mark begins exploring alternative options, including offers from unknown sellers, the line between opportunity and danger becomes unclear. With Matt also searching for similar parts and Bob understanding the technical value of these components, the pressure builds even more. This is not just about fixing a car anymore. It is about making the right decision in a situation where one wrong move could cost thousands of pounds as the search for a solution continues. Mark McCann finds himself going deeper into the hidden world of rare car parts, where deals are not simple and trust is often uncertain. After realizing that getting a gearbox directly from the manufacturer is either impossible or extremely expensive, he starts exploring alternative offers coming through messages, emails, and contact from around the world. This is where the situation begins to feel both exciting and risky at the same time. Among the different options, two offers stand out. One from Dubai, which is very expensive and slightly secretive, and another from Australia, which appears more structured and believable. The Australian deal is introduced through a man who claims to represent a client with two damaged Bugatti Veyron cars, and he explains that one car is being used to fix the other, while the remaining parts are being sold. This explanation sounds logical, especially because this method is already known in the rebuild world. Even Matt Armstrong has used similar strategies in the past, buying damaged cars and combining parts to create one working vehicle. Because of this, the story feels real and believable. At the same time, Bob, with his technical understanding, knows that a gearbox from such a rare car is extremely valuable, not just as a replacement, but also as an asset that could increase in value over time. This adds another layer to the decision, because now it is not just about fixing the car, it is also about making a smart investment. The seller even suggests a deal where the gearbox can be tested before full payment is made, which makes everything feel safer and more professional. This kind of arrangement gives Mark confidence, because it looks like the seller is willing to cooperate and reduce the risk. However, even with all these positive signs, there are still small doubts that cannot be ignored. The deal involves large amounts of money, long-distance shipping, and people who have never met face-to-face. Despite this, the situation is presented in such a convincing way that it becomes easy to focus on the opportunity instead of the danger. Mark begins to feel hopeful again, thinking that this could finally be the solution to his problem, while Matt also keeps a close interest in the situation because he might need the same part. What makes this moment so important is the balance between logic and emotion. Everything makes sense on paper, but deep down, there's still a risk that cannot be fully controlled as the discussions move forward. The situation becomes more serious because now real money is involved, and the decisions are no longer just ideas, they are actions. Mark McCann starts negotiating the price of the gearbox, and this is where the pressure really builds. The seller initially suggests a figure close to £100,000, which is already presented as a good deal compared to the official price from Bugatti, but it is still a huge amount of money for something that cannot be fully tested yet. Mark tries to think smartly and lowers his offer to around £50,000, hoping to reduce the risk. After some back and forth, they settle near £60,000, which still feels like a gamble, but also like a possible opportunity. At this stage, Matt Armstrong is also watching closely because he understands how rare and valuable such a gearbox is, especially when both of them are dealing with similar issues in their own projects. Meanwhile, Bob's technical mindset adds another layer of thinking. He knows that even if the gearbox is not perfect, many of its components, like the control unit and internal parts, are extremely rare and could still hold value. This creates a situation where the risk starts to feel more acceptable, because even a partial success could be useful. However, the biggest problem remains the same. How do you trust that the gearbox actually works? To solve this, Mark creates a deal structure that seems safe on the surface. He plans to pay a deposit first, then inspect and test the gearbox, and only pay the full amount if everything checks out. This sounds like a smart move, and the seller agrees to these terms without much resistance. That agreement itself builds even more confidence, because it makes the seller appear honest and cooperative. Mark even goes a step further by asking for personal verification, like a passport image, to confirm the seller's identity. This step gives him a sense of security, as it feels like real proof that the person exists and can be trusted. But in reality, this is where the danger quietly grows. Scammers often use exactly these methods to gain trust. They provide just enough information to look real, while hiding the truth underneath. What makes this situation even more confusing is the seller's behavior. He does not act like a typical scammer. He answers calls, explains details, and stays in constant contact. This makes it very difficult for Mark to see any clear red flags. Instead of feeling like a trap, the deal starts to feel like a calculated risk worth taking. At this point, the emotional pressure of fixing the car, combined with the logical structure of the deal, pushes Mark to move forward. It is no longer just about whether the gearbox is real. It is about whether he is willing to take the risk to finally solve his problem as the deal moves from planning into action. The story takes a dramatic shift when Mark McCann decides to travel to Malaga to complete the process in person. This moment feels like a turning point because everything now depends on real-world verification rather than just messages and phone calls. The plan sounds simple: meet the seller, inspect the gearbox, confirm it works, and finalize the deal, but the emotional weight behind this trip is huge. After weeks of uncertainty, this feels like the moment where everything could finally come together. At the same time, Matt Armstrong remains closely connected to the situation, knowing that the outcome could also affect his own project if the gearbox turns out to be real and usable. Meanwhile, Bob understands that physically seeing the part is the only true way to confirm its condition, because with something as complex as a Bugatti Veyron gearbox, no amount of talking can replace actual inspection. When Mark and his team arrive in Malaga, there is a mix of excitement and nervous energy. It feels like they are one step away from solving a massive problem. However, that feeling quickly begins to change when the seller does not show up at the agreed meeting point. At first, it seems like a small delay, something that can happen during travel, but as time passes, the situation becomes more uncomfortable. Calls go unanswered, messages take longer to receive replies, and the clear structure of the deal begins to break down. Then suddenly, a new explanation appears. The gearbox is no longer in Malaga and is instead being transported to the UK. This unexpected change creates confusion and raises serious questions. Why would such an important detail change at the last moment? Why was the trip even necessary if the part was never going to be there? Despite these doubts, the seller continues to communicate and provides detailed explanations about logistics, drivers, and transport routes. This is what makes the situation so difficult to judge. On one hand, everything feels wrong: the mismeeting, the changing story, the lack of physical proof. On the other hand, the level of detail in the seller's explanations makes it hard to believe that it is all fake. Mark finds himself stuck between two possibilities. Either this is a complicated but real deal, or it is a very well-planned scam. That mental conflict becomes the most stressful part of the journey, Because every decision now feels like it could either save the situation or make it worse. As confusion continues to grow, Mark McCann tries to stay calm and gather more proof. But the situation becomes even more complicated instead of clearer. The seller keeps sending messages, explaining that the gearbox is now on its way to the UK with a driver, and even shares contact details for this driver. At first, this sounds like progress, because it means the part might actually exist and is being delivered. However, when Mark tries to contact the driver, there is no proper response, only delays and missed calls. This creates a strange feeling. There is always just enough information to keep hope alive, but never enough to fully confirm anything. At the same time, Matt Armstrong becomes even more involved, as he reveals that he has also received a similar message from the same seller offering parts. This is a critical moment because it shows that the seller is not dealing with just one person. It raises an important question. Is this a genuine supplier with multiple customers, or is it someone trying to target several buyers at once? Bob, with his technical understanding, also starts to question the logic behind the situation. One major concern is that the gearbox is supposedly still attached to the engine during transport, which does not make practical sense. Normally, such heavy and valuable components would be separated to make handling easier and safer. This small but important detail begins to make the story feel less believable. Despite this, the seller continues to behave in a way that does not match a typical scammer. He keeps replying, giving updates, and even creating more detailed explanations about delays and travel issues. This makes it very hard for Mark to fully accept that something is wrong. Emotionally, he is still holding on to the possibility that the deal is real, because walking away would mean accepting a loss and starting the search again from zero. This mental struggle becomes the center of the story. It is no longer just about money or parts. It is about trying to understand reality in a situation where everything feels uncertain. Each new message from the seller creates hope, but at the same time, each missing piece of proof increases doubt. Mark is stuck in a loop where he cannot fully trust the situation, but he also cannot completely reject it. This is exactly how complex scams work. They keep the victim engaged for as long as possible by balancing truth and illusion. As the hours pass and no clear answer appears, the pressure continues to build, pushing Mark closer to a breaking point where he must decide what to believe. The situation finally reaches a breaking point when Mark McCann decides that enough is enough and takes a direct step to verify the truth in the real world. Instead of relying on messages and calls, he chooses to visit the physical address that the seller had provided earlier. This decision is important because it shifts everything from theory to reality. If the seller is genuine, this visit should confirm everything. If not, it will expose the truth immediately. With a mix of hope and doubt, Mark and his team travel to the location, still holding on to a small belief that this could all be a misunderstanding. At the same time, Matt Armstrong remains involved from a distance, waiting to hear the outcome, because it could also affect his own situation. Bob, thinking practically, already understands that this step will likely reveal the truth, because physical verification is something scammers usually cannot maintain. When they arrive at the address, the moment feels tense. Everything depends on what happens next. But instead of meeting the seller, they are greeted by a completely different person who has no idea who Andrew is. The house is real, the location is real, but the connection to the seller is completely fake. This is the moment where all the confusion disappears and is replaced by a clear and harsh reality. They have been scammed. All the detailed conversations, the logical explanations, the constant communication, and the carefully planned story were all part of a setup designed to build trust. What makes this realization even more shocking is how convincing the scam was. It was not rushed or careless. It was slow, detailed, and believable at every step. The seller did not disappear after receiving the deposit. Instead, he continued the story, adding more layers, creating delays, and keeping everyone engaged. This level of effort shows that the scammer was experienced and understood how to manipulate trust over time. Mark now realizes that the 3,500-pound deposit is likely gone, and there is very little chance of getting it back. The emotional impact of this moment is strong, not just because of the money, but because of the time, energy, and trust that were invested. The journey to Malaga, the planning, the hope, all it was based on something that was never real. it becomes clear that this was never about a gearbox at all. It was about creating a believable opportunity that was just realistic enough to make someone take the risk. After the truth becomes clear, Mark McCann is left not only with financial loss, but also with a deeper realization about how easily trust can be manipulated when emotions are involved. The 3,500-pound deposit is gone, but more importantly, the entire experience forces him to reflect on the decisions that led him here. He starts to understand that the pressure of fixing his Bugatti Veyron played a major role in making him vulnerable. When you are dealing with a car worth nearly £1 million that cannot even move, every possible solution starts to feel worth trying. This urgency can slowly reduce caution, even for someone experienced. At the same time, Matt Armstrong also represents a parallel path in this story, showing how common these challenges are in the world of high-end car rebuilds. Both of them are facing similar issues: limited access to parts, high costs, and the need to rely on unofficial sources. Bob, with his technical perspective, understands that while the mechanical challenge is difficult, the bigger danger often comes from the human side of the process: trusting the wrong people. This situation becomes a clear example of how modern scams are no longer simple or obvious. They are carefully designed, patient, and built on realistic details. The scammer did not rush or act suspiciously in the beginning. Instead, he created a believable story, provided logical explanations, and stayed in contact long enough to remove doubt. This is what made the trap so effective. Mark realizes that even though he tried to protect himself with structured payments and verification steps, the entire deal was still based on one thing: trust in a person he had never met. That is where the real weakness was. Despite the disappointment, he does not let this experience stop him. Instead, he treats it as a lesson, understanding that setbacks are part of the journey, especially in a field as complex as rebuilding rare cars. The story ends not with success, but with growth. It shows that even failures can have value if they teach something important. For viewers and anyone involved in similar situations, the message is clear. No matter how good a deal looks, and no matter how detailed the explanation sounds, always be careful when a large amount of money and unknown people are involved. After the scam becomes fully clear, Mark McCann is left in a strange position where the emotional impact is almost stronger than the financial loss. The money itself is important, but what hurts more is the time, effort, and trust that went into the entire process. He reflects on how the deal started with excitement and hope, especially with the idea of finally fixing the Bugatti Veyron gearbox and getting the car back on the road. At the beginning, everything felt structured and logical, and even the involvement of people like Matt Armstrong made the situation feel more believable, because similar rebuild stories had worked in the past. However, looking back, Mark starts to see how each step slowly pushed him deeper into uncertainty. The seller never gave one obvious red flag. Instead, he created many small, believable moments that together formed a convincing story. Bob's technical understanding now plays an important role in reflecting on the situation, as he explains how complex mechanical projects often attract both genuine experts and opportunistic scammers. In high-value industries like exotic car parts, it is very difficult to tell the difference at first glance, because both real sellers and fake ones often use similar language and confidence. This is what makes the environment so risky. Mark begins to understand that the biggest mistake was not one single decision, but a chain of small choices made under pressure. Each time, the deal seemed almost real, which made it harder to step away. The idea of solving the gearbox problem, saving a rare car, and even potentially making a smart investment all combined into one strong motivation. That motivation slowly reduced caution. Even though safety steps were taken, like deposits, verification requests, and structured payments, they were not enough to protect against a well-planned deception. The lesson becomes very clear. When emotion and urgency take control, logic becomes weaker. This realization is not easy, but it is important. Instead of treating the experience as just a failure, Mark starts to see it as part of the learning process in dealing with high-risk automotive projects. In the world of rare cars, not every opportunity is real, and not every convincing story leads to success in the aftermath of the failed deal. Mark McCann begins to rebuild his thinking process around how high-value car projects should be handled in the future, especially when dealing with something as rare and complex as a Bugatti Veyron. The experience forces him to slow down mentally and reassess how decisions are made when pressure is involved. Before this incident, the focus was mainly on solving problems quickly, finding parts, contacting sellers, and moving fast to keep the project alive. But now he understands that speed without verification can create serious risk. At the same time, he also reflects on how involvement from people like Matt Armstrong influenced the mindset of the situation. Seeing others successfully rebuild complex cars creates a belief that most problems can be solved if the right opportunity appears. However, Bob's more grounded technical perspective highlights an important truth. Mechanical problems are often easier to solve than human deception. Machines follow logic, but people do not always behave predictably, especially in high-pressure financial situations. This contrast becomes a key lesson from the entire experience. Mark starts to think more carefully about how trust is built, realizing that consistent identity, physical proof, and independent verification are far more important than detailed explanations or constant communication. The scam itself was not successful because it was complicated, but because it was believable at every stage. It never pushed too hard, never acted too suspiciously, and always stayed just realistic enough to keep hope alive. That is what made it effective. As he reflects further, Mark also recognizes that the world of rare car parts is naturally filled with both genuine opportunities and high-risk traps. The scarcity of components for vehicles like the Veyron creates a market where people are willing to take big risks, and where scammers can easily take advantage of urgency and emotion. Despite the frustration, this experience does not stop him from continuing his automotive journey. Instead, it becomes a turning point in how he approaches future deals. The focus shifts from chasing quick solutions to building safer systems of verification and patience. In the end, the story becomes less about losing money and more about gaining awareness. It shows that even in a world of engineering, horsepower, and mechanical precision, human decisions remain the most unpredictable and sometimes the most dangerous part of any project. As the situation fully settles, Mark McCann begins to look at the entire experience with a more balanced mindset, understanding that in the world of ultra-rare cars like the Bugatti Veyron, risk and opportunity often exist side by side. Every major project in this space involves uncertainty, whether it is sourcing parts, finding skilled engineers, or dealing with international suppliers. What this experience taught him is that the biggest danger is not always the technical side of the build, but the human side of trust. Even experienced creators like Matt Armstrong, who have successfully rebuilt complex cars before, still operate in a world where not every offer can be taken at face value. Bob, with his practical engineering mindset, reinforces this lesson by emphasizing that mechanical systems are predictable, but people are not. A gearbox will either work or it won't, but a person can change their story, delay communication, or disappear entirely. That unpredictability is what makes scams so effective in high-value industries. Mark now understands that what made the situation dangerous was not just the promise of a rare gearbox, but the combination of urgency, emotion, and opportunity all arriving at the same time. When those three elements align, judgment becomes harder, even for experienced individuals. Looking back, he sees how each step of the process slowly built confidence in something that had never been fully verified. From the initial messages to the structured payment plan, everything felt logical enough to proceed. Yet none of it had real-world confirmation until it was too late. This realization changes how he thinks about future deals. Instead of focusing only on whether an opportunity looks good, he now considers whether it can be independently verified before any money is committed. The experience also highlights how storytelling can be used both positively and negatively. In this case, the scam worked not because of force or pressure, but because of consistency and detail. It felt real, because it was carefully constructed to match expectations of how a legitimate deal might look. In the end, the story becomes a reminder that in high-stakes environments, caution is not about fear, it is about control. And even when things go wrong, the lessons learned can sometimes be more valuable than the money lost. After everything that happened, Mark McCann begins to focus on rebuilding both the project and his confidence, while still processing the lessons from the failed gearbox deal involving the Bugatti Veyron. The experience leaves a lasting impact because it shows how even well-planned decisions can go wrong when based on incomplete information. In the world of rare cars, where parts are scarce and prices are extremely high, Every decision carries weight. Mark realizes that the pressure to keep the project moving forward made him more open to risk than he normally would be. At the same time, seeing others like Matt Armstrong successfully complete difficult rebuilds creates an environment where big risks start to feel normal, even expected.